Good afternoon. Welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Today we are talking about modern astrophotography, or are we? Do we have a secret today? I feel like something happened today, this morning, that maybe Aaron and Jack are gonna clue me in on. But yes, we are here with the wonderful team from Sigma. We got Aaron Norberg, Jack Fusco joining us to talk about astrophotography and possibly a new Sigma lens drop. Aaron, Jack, what's going on, guys?
Great to be here. Very, very excited. Just to talk about whatever happens to come up today.
Whatever happens to come up. Look, we're going to leave that up to you, Jack. You get to decide what we talk about today. And the viewers, we're just going to have to sit here and take it and take the information in. A huge thank you to you guys, of course, and to the entire team at Sigma for this exciting announcement and for sharing it with us here live on the airwaves. I'm going to remind you all that we will take any questions you have. We have Aaron here from Sigma, who's going to be our tech guy for the hour. So if you guys do have any tech questions about either this lens or any Sigma gear, he'll be behind the scenes there. Jack, you get the fun visual presentation today. So we're going to turn it over to you, and I'll see you guys in a little bit for some Q&A.
We'll be talking about the brand new Sigma 14 millimeter f1.4 DDDN art lens. It is the world first f1.4 14 millimeter lens, which is just a game changer and an absolute dream lens for astrophotography. I have been fortunate enough to take it out a number of times so far, and I'm excited to share some images and kind of talk about it a little bit. And yeah, we'll take questions as we kind of go along. Derek, if you've got anything along the way, happy to kind of jump back and forth a little bit. So I received the lens, and initially, with astrophotography, nothing ever goes as planned. I had a list of 7 locations that I had scattered out across the entire United States for my potential shoot locations. And when the new moon came around, the forecast was terrible for all 7 locations. So I knew of a park in the Florida Keys that was working on their dark sky status. So I checked the forecast, and sure enough, Florida Keys had some clear skies for 2 nights in a row, which I was hoping was going to be enough. So within 24 hours, I booked a flight and I was making my way down there. So it was a location that I had not been to before. Like I said, I knew that they were working with the International Dark Sky Association on their dark sky status, and I knew that would be, a pretty good spot to start shooting the stars. So the lens itself is, it's absolutely beautiful. If you've used the 14 millimeter DG HSM 1.8 art lens, it's pretty similar in size, but obviously has the faster aperture. So I'm going to talk about just a few of the images that I captured, and then I'll show some kind of the tech side of how differences in the aperture, and also I think everyone is going to be anxious to see what the corners look like, because that's always the big question when it comes to any lens for astrophotography is, how do the corners look? How do the stars look in the corner? How does it render color? How sharp is everything? We're shooting in challenging conditions, very little light, hopefully, and it's really asking a lot from our gear. So this was not necessarily going through the images in order that I took them, but this is one of my favorite shots from the trip. It was on my second night, and the clouds had just kind of passed through and started to clear out. So the skies were just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, dark. You could see a bit of the color above the horizon, and below the core of the Milky Way was a whole bunch of air glow. And when I was shooting down there, I really tried my best to vary the techniques that I was using, whether I was just shooting single exposures or shooting exposures that I was planning on stacking, or like this photo, I would use a star tracker. So I used the star tracker at the top of these stairs down to the beach for a 60-second exposure of the stars, and then turn that off. My foreground exposure, you can kind of zoom in, see a little bit more detail up here. And it's gorgeous throughout. I was shooting with the Sigma FPL, which is the Sigma camera body. It's a 61 megapixel camera. And it paired quite nicely with the 14 millimeter 1.4. And then there's, take a look down across the water. We had that beautiful blue water. So that was kind of my goal. I had, I spent much time during the day scouting locations as possible, and then kind of moving along, trying to capture as much as night possible. I had those 2 nights that were going to be clear. The first night was a little bit windy. The second night was just, a little bit more calm. And this was just an example while I was waiting for the Milky Way core to rise. You can kind of see it over here of just how much air glow there was in the sky. You can see just all that kind of green and bits of red throughout it. So the lens just renders color just beautifully. So I'm really, really excited to capture and see that much. Having that much air glow just means you're normally in a pretty dark location. So it was visible with the naked eye, not as much color, but then seeing that in the back of the camera was really, really exciting. This is a stacked exposure. 1 exposure for me standing there, and then a couple exposures for the sky. We'll kind of zoom out, and after that, we'll kind of take a look at the aperture differences. So this is just a mosaic of 3 different images, with the left one being shot with an aperture of f1.4, and then 1.8 and f2.8 all the way to the right. And these are completely unedited raw files. Even though astrophotography, we're working in the complete dark, we really want to capture as much light as possible. So we're escaping light pollution, but still working on capturing as much light as we can. And that air glow and that starlight is what provides the light that we're able to use to whether light the foreground or pick up as much detail in the sky. You can see the big difference in these 2 images, how much more brightness we have in the core of the Milky Way, and then just more detail in the foreground as well. Then all the way over to the 2.8. It's still workable if that was if you're just using a lens that only had an aperture as 2.8, but your final image is going to be a little bit darker. Generally, we start with a file like this, and then we'll apply and edit to try and bring out more detail. So when we're pushing up detail from those shadows, that's when we start to introduce noise, which is why it's important to start with an overall brighter photo. And again, the 2 images on the left, or the far left, starting the far left is shot at f1.4, and then 1.8, and then over to 2.8. So there's a lot of detail on all of them, but just way more detail and less noise because of being able to shoot that faster aperture and let more light in, and then just have more room when it comes to editing. So we'll jump back to image up top here. This is another shot. So I use the star tracker here, and you'll kind of notice it if you start to pay attention to the composition of the photos. If I have a composition where there isn't too much breaking the plane of the horizon, then that's can be a good candidate for either using a star tracker or for stacking exposures, because in using those techniques, we need to take a separate exposure for the foreground and then make sure they line up properly. And using a star tracker, that means with if you're not familiar with star trackers, basically just a device that slowly rotates to the left and keeps your camera pointed at the same spot in the sky for longer than you would be able to without the stars trailing. But with that camera being rotated by the device means now that the Earth is blurry in that example. So you have to take a separate exposure with the tracking device turned off, and then line those 2 images up, or if you're shooting mosaic, however many images you took, line them up to hopefully have everything placed exactly where it would be for your final image. So since I had just had a pretty straight horizon line of the ocean, it seemed like a really great spot for it. So again, just tons of detail in the sky. You can see like the bands of air glow dripping through here. I was driving through, I had pins dropped because this wasn't one of my 7 scouted locations. I spent a fair bit of time scouting those 7 other locations. Before I go somewhere, I always kind of drop pins and know where I'm heading before it gets dark and ahead of time. Unfortunately, because of that bad weather forecast, I didn't have, and this not being on my list, I did not have luxury of being in all these spots before it got totally dark. So I was still, I tried to get to as many potential locations during the day as possible. And I would drop a pin on Google Maps and then visit later on. But then I was also using like just a satellite view on Google Maps to try and find locations that were suitable. As I mentioned before, this was the first time I had been in the Florida Keys. What I did not know was how many beaches are completely inaccessible at night. So, the state parks, they have two different state parks. The one that I mentioned that was working on their dark sky status, and Curry Hammock State Park. And the photo that this was taken at, I think, Bahi State Park, pronunciation, or I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. They close at night unless you're camping. So thankfully, I was able to get a pass to be camping at this location, and just kind of, wandered off respectfully, keeping lights low, and was able to find a couple of really beautiful spots. There's very little light pollution. You can see like nothing along the horizon, and then just like that, again, star tracker for the sky and a longer exposure. You can take a look again at the corners on this one. It just looks really great on the shot, just a lot of detail in the core of the Milky Way. So we'll continue with some shots from the Florida Keys. So one of the other really cool things about the new 14mm lens is that it has space for rear filters or rear soft filters. And whether using ND filters or kind of like a soft star glow filter, which does exactly as the name kind of implies, gives you that glow around different stars. It's something that has been traditionally used in astrophotography for highlighting constellations, or to any just kind of bright stars or planets within your photo. The cool thing about using the rear mounted filters is, as opposed to like the front mounted filters, is that you avoid any sort of vignetting from the outside of the filter. And it's the lens cap of the new 14. It also has two spots for your filters. So I shot this. It was a 20-second exposure for the sky, and kind of a single exposure. So it's 20 seconds for the sky in the foreground, excuse me, with that soft glow filter. And there's enough kind of bright stars in the photo that I just really liked the effect that it gave to this image. So this was a photo that I had actually stopped at this spot on my first night, and I just really loved the lone palm tree. Unfortunately, on the first night, it was much, much windier, so I just couldn't get a photo of the palms still enough. There's a little bit of movement in the top palm here, but just a single exposure, just tons and tons of detail. The Milky Way. One of the cool things about shooting so far south is that the Milky Way clears the horizon by so much more. So when you're in a location with dark skies, you have just tons and tons of detail, with the core being that much further away from the horizon and any sort of atmosphere that would interrupt or would kind of fade out some of the more fine details of the Milky Way. You can see the south, just all that awesome, awesome detail. But I also learned while I was there, I noticed that there was an excessive amount of seaweed, which at first I didn't realize it wasn't totally normal. A few days after I got back, I heard on the news that there was like this huge swarm of seaweed, I think they called it, that was headed towards the Keys, that was causing just a horrible smell on the beaches. So my short stay in the Keys was often not the most pleasant smelling, but it was due to this unusual amount of seaweed that was washing up on the beaches. But one of the challenging things that I ran into is that there just weren't a whole lot of areas that had much foreground, or much kind of put in the foreground. It's kind of why I looked for those pathways. In this area, I kind of just found some pile of seaweed and then a little bit of sand in front of it, just to kind of add some interest in like the color, kind of moving out to that really beautiful turquoise water. And then thankfully the clouds were staying clear of most of the sky, and just really kind of providing a nice framing for the top of the photo. And yeah, so Normally, when I get a new lens for the first time, the first couple of images I take are kind of test images where I'm taking an exposure and wide open, and I'm checking the corners. So take that shot, and I'll use the back of the camera to zoom all the way in. And all of the images that I'm showing were all shot at f1.4, and that's what I'll do. I'll take that first shot because I know I'm there on an assignment, or I'm just using a new lens for the first time, and I want to make sure that whatever I capture is going to be as high quality as possible. So took my first photo at f1.4, reviewed in the back of the FP, and I checked the corners to see how everything looked. Very often wide angle lenses, or just any lens shot wide open, there's a possible it's possible that the corners don't look quite as good as if you centered the photo. You get some of the stars, you get kind of those wings on it, or that coma. And as you can see here, the corners look amazing. Like I knew that at some point Sigma would release a updated version of the 14mm f1.8 DG HSM lens, which was a mainstay in my bag for years. One of my go-to lens for time lapsing and for shooting the northern lights, just capturing a massive view of the night sky. I did not expect it to be an f1.4 lens, so I was incredibly excited when I found that out, and then also just really anxious and excited to kind of test it out. And those first couple of images that I took, and then I checked the quality of the corners, I was so blown away. It surpassed my expectations of quality in the corners. I think the images kind of speak for themselves. Like the corners look stunning, and then it didn't take long where I almost kind of forgot that I was really kind of worried about some of the technical stuff while I was capturing everything. The skies were just so beautiful and dark, and the lens was just performing so well that it just kind of drifted to the back of my mind, to be honest. So I kind of kept going through it, and eventually I kind of like, oh, I haven't really checked on stuff. And also, like, one of the really cool features of this lens that was carried over from the 20mm lens is a manual focus lock. So once you set your focus to infinity, it's just a switch on the lens that allows you to keep, or just it disengages the focus ring. So if you're at infinity, you hit the manual focus lock, then you can swing the focus ring, and it just completely is unaffected by the focus ring moving after that switch is locked. So it's such a cool feature that was first introduced on the 20mm f1.4 DGDN lens. I was really excited to see that was part of the new 14.
Yeah, so there's one question right now we're kind of trying to hash out about trying to make sure that you have exposure where you need it to for the stars when you're doing a multi-exposure technique, just making sure that you're not blowing out detail.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible to blow out detail of the Milky Way, which sounds crazy. If that's happening, you're in somewhere that is, a super, super dark location. And in that case, I would always, if I found, whether I'm using a single exposure or stacking exposures or using a star tracker, if I noticed that, the first thing I would do would be lowering the ISO, because that is going to be, that's the setting that introduces noise the quickest. So if I can back that off, that'll be, my first step at making sure things are kind of not blown out and kind of looking pretty solid across the board. I saw someone mentioned or asked about the lens heater. So this lens also has it's a built-in retainer. So basically just kind of like a lip on the end of the lens that will keep a lens heater in place. And the question was, where do I find myself using a lens heater? And they're most effective if you're shooting somewhere that is going to have a big change in temperature. So, very often, like if I'm shooting, higher altitudes where the temperature drops quite a bit at night, near water with a temperature change, and that lens heater will hopefully keep that condensation from forming on the lens, which can, or condensation, or just the lens from fogging up, shooting up in. A lot of Aurora shoots, I end up using them just because just trying to keep the lens warm and from freezing over. Yeah, so anywhere that there's going to be a big drop or big change in temperature is kind of a good reason to at least preventively have one. in the past, I've used rubber bands and hand warmers, but it's nice having something that will just kind of hold that lens heater in place and not have to worry about it, kind of being pushed a little bit forward and then causing either like a little bit of vignetting or just completely ruining your image, depending on how far it drifts over the edge of the lens. This is an image that I was kind of scattered out of spot, and I had actually shot maybe a mile down the path to the right. And on my way back, I just kind of noticed, how nice that kind of opening to the ocean looked. It just these soft pastel colors in the night. Again, the clouds were fortunate enough to kind of stay pretty low in the sky and not really cover up too much of the Milky Way, which can kind of be a bummer. It also kind of added like a nice bit of atmosphere. So again, shot wide open at f1.4. This ISO 3200 with the FPL. I tried to keep it between 1600 and 3200. If I was stacking exposures, I might have gone a little bit higher at 6400 because with the stacking, it reduces noise a little bit. But I was really trying to focus on keeping the images as clean as possible. We can look at closer look at the detail here. And yeah, this was in that state park I mentioned that is working on their dark sky status, or next to the one working on their dark sky status. And one of the things I noticed was that in this area that was like super dark and no ambient light, I was still able to pick up a lot of green actually in the leaves and the trees where they would be silhouetted, and it's kind of like that subtle touch that I think makes a difference in an image. And it's something that when looking at it, you may not initially kind of have your eyes drawn to, but a lot of times it is those things that don't necessarily grab your attention right away that take an image from when it's okay to one that just has something that feels a little bit special about it. Take a little break from just the artistic side and hop straight to what I'm sure people are very interested in. Yeah, this is an example of 100% crop in the far corner, shot at f1.4, 1.8, and 2.8. And the same example images that I was using for showing the difference in apertures. And I think that they just really, the quality speaks for itself. Like I can go on about how awesome and impressive that is, but even very often people will buy a prime lens that has a fast aperture with the intention of being able to stop it down to have good enough quality. I think this shows that you don't need to do that at all, which is huge, right? Like you're not losing the amount of potential in gathering light to improve the quality in the corner of the images. So this is, kind of what I saw when I first took those test images, and why everything I shot, other than just example images, was all at f1.4, which is so impressive. I think the engineers at Sigma absolutely really killed it with this. I think this lens, is sharper at 1.4 than even the 14 f1.8 at 1.8, which is, I think it's saying something pretty impressive. This was a spot that I was super excited for, and one of my favorite things to do with a 14mm ultra wide angle lens. This is actually, it's the ocean reflecting all the stars above. The area was just so perfectly still. The water was just like a mirror. I was super excited. I carry around like a tabletop tripod in my bag at all times for a case just like this, to be able to get the camera as close to the water as possible and just capture some massive reflection of the stars. This is a single exposure, and to me that was like, it's a, I don't want to call it a plain image, but there's not a lot in it, but it's just a very peaceful photo when I look at it. And that's something that I always try to capture an image that kind of can speak to the way it feels to stand there, and standing there felt very peaceful. This was, was very representative of how it felt there. We have the dark skies providing that awesome visibility with the air glow. You can see green, red streaking through the sky, kind of almost framing the Milky Way, the star, or the clouds right below it. Yeah, so that was one of my favorite photos, and I have a little bit of a time lapse and just a couple variations of this because I was so excited. After that, the next location I shot at was in California, so opposite side of the country. And if you have not been on any of these Sigma social channels, you can check out a really cool behind the scenes video that we shot out in the Alabama hills. Talks about the experience a little bit. This was, it's a pretty famous spot. Alabama Hills is a great spot for astrophotography. It's a absolutely beautiful spot that is used very often as a backdrop for movies. That is, see Mount Whitney in the background, the highest peak in the lower 48 states. End of the night, again, just a lot of air glow, which is, again, super, super dark location, and just tons of detail. And that, I think, is what we're dreaming of when we're shooting astrophotography, to be able to get as much detail as possible in both the foreground and sky, especially when you have these really interesting locations. It's it's always kind of a balance, because you can, if you're shooting during a new moon, then there's not going to be any moonlight to help light up the foreground at all. It's something that I love doing, but you sacrifice a little bit of detail in the sky, so the moon will wash out detail in the Milky Way or the amount of stars that you're able to see. But shooting at a new moon will give you the sky as dark as possible, but then being able to either take images at a very fast aperture, or if you're taking separate foreground exposures at a longer exposure time, and then just pick up detail. Because if you're traveling somewhere that has a really interesting location or interesting landscape, you don't want it silhouetted. You want to be able to see detail, and that super fast aperture f1.4 it really helps being able to do that. There, I made my way over to Death Valley, and as I mentioned before, things never quite go as planned with astrophotography. A few hours before this, there was flash flooding in the park, and this is at Zabriskie Point. And so if you're familiar with Death Valley, Zabriskie Point is kind of a little bit higher elevation, but you kind of pass a road where you can turn off to Badwater Basin and some of the other very famous spots in Death Valley. Right around sunset, it was supposed to be cloudy, but we just got a ton of rain, and a bunch of people ended up getting stuck because there's flash flooding is it happens very quickly, and there's not a lot of service in different places of the park. So if you're not looking at the forecast ahead of time, or even if you are, sometimes you can just kind of get unlucky with these situations. But a few cars got stuck. We had said it was like a monsoon basically, and then about 5 hours later, the skies kind of cleared up. We hung out until after the flash flood warnings had gone away, made our way out, waited for the skies to clear, and this was the reward of it. Kind of a beautiful, beautiful dark sky, again capturing a ton of detail in the Milky Way, and then just a really unique foreground. And this was a stacked exposure. 7 exposures shot at ISO 3200, f1.4, and 13-second exposures. So then I stacked them all again. I mentioned before that really defined horizon line is something that I look for if I'm going to utilize one of those techniques. So that made a really great candidate. One other image that I wanted to show, and then we can kind of talk a few other things about the lens. I took this on the same trip out to Alabama Hills and then Death Valley. After 2 nights in Death Valley, Friday night and Saturday night, I had a flight leaving from Los Angeles at 6 a.m. And it felt kind of wasteful to be in a hotel room that whole time. So for some reason, I decided just to, after 3 nights of being up the entire night, to spend the entire night shooting and head straight to my flight. So I drove to one of my favorite beaches in California, in Malibu, and unfortunately, was just completely fogged in. The forecast is supposed to be clear, but that marine layer that they often get on the West Coast kind of killed the visibility of all the stars. So I drove up into the mountains and was hopeful that I could get above the fog, and eventually found a viewpoint where I could overlook. You can see over here, this bright line is the Pacific Coast Highway, and yeah, I ended up hanging out in that spot for about 4.5 hours shooting stills and a little bit of time lapse. And this is something that that kind of inversion layer where you're shooting the sky above a layer of clouds is not always like an easy thing to predict. It was always kind of an image, shooting the Milky Way above it was something that I'd wanted to do for a really long time. So it felt rewarding, and it felt like finally making the choice to stay up until my flight at 6 a.m. was the right thing to do, even though it was completely wrecked the next day. But that is so often the case with astrophotography and traveling for it, is that it's a lot of coffee, not a lot of sleep, especially when we're heading to these locations and you're trying to scout during the day and then you have to stay awake all night. Sleep just doesn't have a lot of room in there. But yeah, so far, those are some of my favorite images that I have taken with the new 14mm lens. Might stop sharing for just a second, and then I can pull up a couple other kind of behind the scenes type photos. But yeah, it's been a super exciting lens to head out with so far. I am positive it is going to be a lens that stays in my bag, or is always with me. It'll be taken out of my bag quite often to shoot, but yeah, that super fast aperture, ultra wide field of view, I think is something that is just perfect for capturing that expansive view of the night sky. And then being able to pick up so much detail is one of the reasons we use prime lenses, and that quality. I think I was gonna, one more time, we'll pull up this, because I think I can talk all day about the quality of this lens, but I think this more than speaks for itself. And if anyone has been looking for a lens to use, I guarantee that I've searched or I've looked for in reviews how it performs in the corners. It almost looks identical from f1.4 to 2.8, and that's the highest compliment you can get to a lens, is that you don't have to worry about the quality and how it performs.
Jack, I wanted to jump in and ask you a question while we're looking at this.
Sure.
When when they reach out to you, when Sigma reaches out to you and they want you to try out this lens before it comes out, you as a photographer, what are you looking at? Are you looking to put it through the paces and test out, in challenging scenarios? Or obviously, you're shooting landscapes, so something like fast autofocus might not be as much of a priority as somebody who's using it for a different use case. What is on your checklist of things that you're looking for when you get your hands on a new piece of glass?
Yeah, so when the first thing I'm heading out, basically I try to put it through like a checklist of, like I said, the corners are almost always the first thing that I check, right? Is how does this lens perform at its widest aperture, right? Because if it isn't usable at f1.4, that's kind of sure, then maybe you get like a better quality stop down, but the world's first 1.4 14mm lens, so being able to actually use it and it's not even like, oh well, it's passable, right? Like the quality is incredible. You're not sacrificing anything by shooting wide open, which is the first thing that I look at, right? That's going to be the most demanding part of the lens. But then when I'm out shooting, I really try to utilize as many techniques as possible, whether it's something that I would commonly use, or just something that I know other people might approach a scene with. My preference is to always capture everything at the same time. I'm personally not a huge fan of taking photos during the day or blue hour photos and then blending them at night. I understand why people do it in that approach, but whether I am going to be stacking images to kind of reduce noise, or using a star tracker and then capturing the foreground separately, I like to do it all consecutively back to back without moving the tripod. Just because astrophotography for me it's such an incredible experience to be there under the stars, that I've had like this weird feeling of obligation to try and recreate that moment and capture things from that moment as accurately as possible. because I think I love standing there so much. I want that image to be representative of me standing there. So heading out with that lens, I want to see how it does in capturing, you know, the ways that I would shoot it, the ways I think other people might shoot it, you know, like I said, whether that's using a star tracker. So really, I kind of have like a mental checklist of the different techniques that I'm going to utilize and the different types of images, and whether that is showing off mostly sky or capturing, you know, longer exposures to the foreground. Yeah, so that's really mostly the approach that I go through, is just kind of trying to be able to have a library of images that I can share with everyone, where, you know, people can look at them and go, oh, that's how I shoot. So that's applicable to me, right? Like I use a star tracker. I want to see how this works with a star tracker. Or like, you know, stacking images is kind of a, you know, a hardwareless way of having cleaner images. So a lot of people, you know, go that route. So being able to show how it performs with all these different techniques is, I guess, hopefully my main goal, and hopefully being able to, you know, just share what it is like and how it performs under the stars. And that's, you know, hopefully what I set out to do, and hopefully what I'm able to present to everybody when I get it.
Awesome. I love that. And we have some other questions that have come in as you were talking. I'll kind of condense down. We have Mike joining us from YouTube. Thank you for the question, Mike. Mike says, realistically, what is the lowest aperture usable? And then we get into focal length discussion. Now, this is a prime, but I guess we can open it up on your thoughts about longest focal lengths for astrophotography. And,
Sure.
You know, we're talking here basically aperture and focal length. Where do you draw your lines as far as astrophotography is concerned?
So focal length, I think, is very determined, or very much determined by the subject that you're shooting. So if, you know, like I've shot mountains at night with like an 85 millimeter, but yeah, it's because like they're pretty far off in the distance. Whereas in this type of location where I don't have, you know, a lot in the distance other than just like an open horizon, it wouldn't be that great of an image here. So I love using longer focal lengths at night. 85, 50, I'll use quite often. You know, being able to fill the frame with a lot of the Milky Way is a really cool way to, you know, to have a composition. But it's very much determined by where you're shooting. So I think in certain locations where you don't have much in the distance, a wide angle is the way to go. If you're somewhere where you have a mountain range that's kind of far off, or you know, any different rock formations, like somewhere like Joshua Tree, and you're not too far from where you're like a decent ways from some of those formations, then a longer focal length works pretty well. And as far as, was it like the slowest aperture that I would find usable? Was that the question?
Yes, I was making sure I wasn't muted there. Yes.
So what I recommend to people, like, because obviously, you know, a faster aperture lens can be, you know, investment, and that's something if you don't have a faster aperture lens. I think my thing is always hoping people still head out to take photos of the stars, and then, you know, eventually you upgrade your equipment. But if you have, say, you just have like a f4 lens, and that's the fastest aperture you have. For that scenario, I would recommend going to shoot maybe around like a quarter moon. And that way you have the aid of a bit of moonlight, or even up to like a half moon. You won't have as much detail in the Milky Way, but you'll have a nice amount of detail in the foreground. You can have like a really interesting shot that still has a ton of stars and a lot of detail in the foreground. Whereas if you took that f.4 or f4 lens to somewhere super dark during a new moon, the foreground is likely going to be very, very dark, and the same for the sky, where you won't have that same level of detail from the Milky Way. So like, even if we pull up this here, like, you know, obviously this is unedited, but the raw file, you can see it 2.8 from all the way to the right. You know, that's a considerable amount darker. So, and that's just at 2.8, so f4 would be even darker. Yeah, so basically the slower your aperture, just kind of use the moonlight to help improve the quality of your images, and improve what's visible in your images. And then hopefully over time, whether you're, you know, hitting up B&H as a rental department and heading out with a, you know, new lens, or one of the workshops that we do, Sigma always is great about making lenses available for everyone. Yeah, and then, you know, hopefully you're able to add a faster aperture lens down the line.
Awesome. We have another question from Sanjay joining us. Welcome, Sanjay, joining us from Vimeo, asking, what time of night do you usually find stars the brightest for shooting?
So that kind of changes throughout the year. You want to make sure that you're kind of past, after sunset, we have blue hour, and then there's a kind of like a nautical twilight, and then finally you get like an astronomical twilight, which is when the sky will finally be at its darkest. So there isn't like a specific time, because it's also dependent on, so what time sunset is, how far north you are, at different times of the year. But normally, say if you give yourself in the mid latitudes, maybe 2 hours after sunset, that'll be considerably dark. But yeah, and then maybe like 2 hours prior to sunrise as well. But if you look for any of things like the Photographer's Ephemeris or Photo Pills has the times of all those different astronomical twilights and blue hour and when they start and stop. So basically, yeah, I would say like if you don't want to look up the apps, give yourself hour 45, 2 hours after sunset, and then you should be pretty dark.
What's your favorite time to go out, Jack? Is there a time that you prefer to photograph, or a certain set of conditions that you favor?
So I have a multi-part answer to that. I love being out during blue hour. I just love that transitional time after sunset when you slowly start to see the stars appearing kind of one by one, and then really cool time to shoot because you kind of have some soft light available for the foreground, and then it feels like it is just a matter of seconds, and then all of a sudden the sky is just full of stars, and I feel like just kind of like this magical moment of looking up and then like, oh wow, now I saw 2 stars a second ago, now there's stars everywhere. That always feels like a really special time. Ideal conditions. I feel like every year I say hopefully I'll be in fewer conditions where I have to worry about frostbite. But I always end up in really cold locations. But the cold locations often have really cool subjects to shoot. Like if you're heading to shoot like the Northern Lights or something, and whether it's like somewhere like Iceland or Northern Canada. I think it's like the type 2 fun where it's terrible in the moment, but then looking back on it, it's some of the favorite stories to tell. Conditions that are like -40 and your hands hurt so bad that you feel like screaming, but you're afraid that if you scream, you'll throw up. But the sky is just so magical that you push through it, and then later on you look at your images and you think back on it and like, oh, that was amazing. Let's go. I can't wait to head back out tonight. And you go back through that cycle again of being in like a considerable amount of pain, which is not great in the moment, but then said later on, it's just kind of makes the story kind of.
Well, it's grueling nights too. I think that's for people who are not astrophotographers. You don't realize how much time it takes to get every single shot. Like you guys put in planning and effort, and sometimes you're sitting there minutes long exposures. And if you mess up your settings, then it's changing everything. All right, wait.
Yeah, it's a lot of waiting for the right conditions. Like there's photos that I've chased for a couple of years. I'm just going back to a spot and waiting for everything to kind of line up. And it's painful when it's happening, or it's painful when you sit there and it just doesn't work out. But then when it finally does, it feels really, really rewarding. And I think that is, I think it's really important is to kind of have those moments that mean something to you, and to not constantly be chasing images only to share. I think that's an easy way to get burnt out, is if you feel like you're taking photos just for other people. I would be doing this if no one cared, but I'm very fortunate that some people do. So each of these nights that I get to go out and shoot are really personally exciting and rewarding for me, and then getting to share them is just kind of a bonus on top of it.
That's awesome. Do you generally go out with people, or are you the type to go out just by yourself? And
I'd say 75% of the time, at least, I'm by myself.
Okay.
Sometimes my dog comes with me whenever possible.
Probably better than most people.
He's great company. Yeah.
Always good. Always good.
But yeah, it's like I enjoy both. I enjoy the process of being there and just kind of taking it all in and having it be really peaceful. But then also getting to share that with somebody can be a really special experience too.
Mhm. Now, Jack, bringing it back while you, and I know you probably have some more stuff, sir. I just want to sneak one more question in here.
Yeah, for
We
sure.
often get asked this on Astro, and admittedly, when I go out to take photos like this, when I make it out to the west and the southwest, I always find myself stuck on focusing. Is manual focus best? The technology now, we've become so accustomed to using the increasingly accurate autofocusing systems. But for something like this, what do you recommend people do for focusing?
So if you're using a mirrorless camera, focusing has gotten a little bit easier because, especially with a lens that has a fast aperture, because you can use the live view. And then what I'll do is I'll find a bright star or planet that doesn't necessarily have to be in the composition that I'm shooting. And I'll point my camera at it. And you kind of just slowly turn your focus ring. Starts off kind of looking like bokeh, and then it gets smaller and smaller. So it's got like a blurry circle. And then at some point it'll look, hopefully like one of these, dots of light. And if you go too far, it starts to get large again. And so you normally kind of just back it off a little bit. And then take a test image and make sure you check somewhere in the center of the image and then off to the sides to see how that looks. And then if you are using the new 14mm lens, you can hit the manual focus lock switch and it'll keep your focus there the entire night. Basically, it'll keep your focus at that spot until you either put it on autofocus or hit the manual focus lock off. So even, putting your camera in your bag, turning it off and turning it back on, your focus is still right where you left it, which is awesome. If you are not using a mirrorless camera, what you can do is kind of use the autofocus during the day on something, pretty far or close to the horizon, and then switch it back to autofocus or manual focus, excuse me, and use that as a starting point. And you can either then try to use your live view, but the live view on DSLRs tends to be a little bit noisier and hard to, pick out brighter stars. But you just make small incremental adjustments and couple test shots. You can use slightly shorter exposures than you normally would. Just, if you're feeling impatient. Yeah, and then that's just kind of a little bit of trial and error that way. But if you're not used to it, focus during the day on something near the horizon, over to manual focus, and then use that as a starting point, or the live view on a mirrorless camera. I think are my two go-to ways.
Awesome. Well, we'll let you get back to wrapping your presentation up here. And if we do have any questions in the meantime, if you guys do want to get those in before we wrap up this hour, definitely.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, because I'm gonna stop sharing real briefly. If you want to keep kind of chatting if there's any other questions, I guess, and then I'll pull up my last image I wanted to share.
Definitely.
If not, I can just kind of keep
go for
chatting about the experience of this lens so far. Yeah, I think, I was super impressed with how this lens performed, and my first thought was, just thinking of the different locations that I can utilize this lens. Again, kind of going back to that question before of, the different focal lengths. So that's kind of when I have a location in mind, I kind of think about all right, what am I going to be shooting, and how do I make the most of that? Is that going to be? I think the image that we use of the splash screen, I've probably shown as two different focal lengths, and I think that change in focal length can just be. It can completely change the impact of your image, and it can completely change what someone thinks when they look at an image. So that's really important. And I'm already thinking about these are the kind of things I have coming up throughout the rest of the year, and the spots that I know are going to be really cool to shoot with this lens. And if after using it, where do I not have planned that I think this lens would be now all of a sudden for? Because being able to shoot at that f1.4, and some of these newer cameras, you can actually shoot live video at night, which is not something that is super common, right? It's not easy to be able to pick up enough detail to shoot video at night. Cool. So I've got one last photo to share. This is another shot from Death Valley, and you can see like that green air glow in it. This was just such a cool moment because I've never seen this much air glow. These couple nights that I was out, we had a lot of air glow when I was in Florida, but I thought the formation of this air glow felt so unique. It looks more like I dropped in a sky from somewhere in Iceland than air glow in Death Valley, which again was able to capture and pull out that detail because of just that super fast aperture. It's kind of really dim, but that long exposure and fast aperture just kind of like unlocks the night sky. So I'm just super excited to keep capturing and shooting with the suns. And I think I believe it is available for order now on the B&H site, and we'll be shipping around the 23rd of this month. So I think people are going to be really excited when they get their hands on it.
Awesome. Now it looks like a great lens. Now we did have a question come in from Ali, join us all the way from New Zealand. So thank you for joining us all the way across the world. It's awesome to see that we can reach people across the world. Lucky enough to live in a place with a very dark sky down in New Zealand. So I haven't really needed to stack, but I would like to experiment with it and see what I can achieve with that technique. Do you have any tips or any suggested resources for somebody who's just starting out with focus stacking?
Cool. Yeah. So, well, I guess first, just to avoid any sort of confusion, like stacking for astrophotography and focus stacking.
Yes. Yes. I misspoke there. Stacking.
Okay. All good.
Yes. We're not talking macro.
Listen, I just want to make sure we're setting people up for, focus stacking at night is something that you can do. It's tedious 100% and not something I have a high interest in doing, to be very honest.
I took us off the wrong exit there. We gotta recalculate.
Stacking for noise reduction.
There you go.
So basically, what I would suggest doing is figuring out, if you're new to astrophotography, or even if you're pretty experienced with it, but stacking is something that is a little bit newer to you, take that single exposure that you think looks great, right? Like stacking isn't going to take, an unusable amount of noise and make it a beautiful photo, but it'll take a very reasonable amount of noise and take it kind of to that next level. So say, for example, your settings were 15-second exposure, you're using the new Sigma 14 and 1.4, so you're shooting at f1.4, your lens handles noise pretty well, so you're somewhere between ISO 3200 and 6400 for that single shot, and you're normally pretty happy with how that looks. I would take 7 to 10 consecutive exposures exactly the same, as close to each other as possible. So if you have a remote release and having your camera in a continuous shooting mode, so you can just lock down that button, then take those exposures right back to back. Because what you have to do, and there's different software. If you're on PC, there's a free program, it's by donation, called Sequator. If you're on Mac, there is a paid program called Starry Landscape Stacker, and they both kind of do a little bit of input from you. They will go image to image and try its best to align all the stars, because even from one image to the next, there's enough movement where the stars, like if you just layered them in Photoshop and just kind of change the opacity, the stars will start to trail. That's how you create star trails. But what we want in our final stacked image is for all of the stars to still be as sharp as possible. So that software aligns each of the images that you put into it, and then hopefully will also give you a perfectly aligned and cleaned up version of your foreground. So after you stack them, you'll have to take it into your editing photo software of choice, and then kind of go through all the edits there. It'll be a bit brighter, and it'll look similar, hopefully, to the images that you've been taking over the much lower amount of noise. And that's kind of, the ultimate goal is to have the most amount of detail with the least amount of noise as possible. That's like the astrophotography goal.
It's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Now, our last question here, Jack, we're going to let you off the hook for the last question and see if we can get Mr. Aaron Norberg on the line there.
Cool.
Susan joining us on Facebook. wants to know what lenses have that manual focus lock switch that Jack was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that I'm just thrilled. There's a couple like little creature comforts that have been added to this lens that not only does it produce amazing imagery, it's a lot easier to get there now. The manual focus lock is one of those. So that's on the 14 millimeter f1.4 DG DN art, as well as the 20 and the 24 f1.4 DG DN art lenses. And like Jack was saying, the really nice thing about that is once you set focus manually in your scene, you can lock it with that switch. And even if you do accidentally hit that ring, it's not going to move focus until you unlock that manual focus lock. So that can be a huge help, especially if you're not really moving within your scene. Once you get set up, you can land focus and just coast on that for most of the night.
Yeah, I will say before that, a lot of people would often see people use tape around their focus ring, which it always made me so nervous because as much as it's possible to tape it in focus, it's also very possible that when you're applying that tape, you're taping your lens out of focus for the entire night.
That would be,
you know, if you're not using it, like you tend to check on it a little bit more, right? But if you in your mind have it set that this tape has saved me, my lens is in focus, and you spend the next 6 hours taking photos, you're going to be very disappointed when you get the photo on your computer.
here's a pro tip, everybody. Go out photographing with somebody like Jack, let him focus your camera, turn the lock on, and then there you're good for the rest of the night.
That's it.
That's it. That's all you got to do. You got to find
Right.
find that with that one friend that's really good at astrophotography and just piggyback one
Just
night.
have that dedicated astro lens, right? Like apparently people photograph during the day, like sunsets and stuff. Like I've heard about this before. Not too experienced in it, but yeah.
We'll have to
one
get you out
focus
there
for
one
me.
day. One day we're gonna force you to go out from 11 to 2 in the afternoon. Look at Aaron's face. Aaron's face. He was disgusted. He's like, "No,
It just sounds too
don't do
easy.
that."
There's so much
Yeah.
daylight. Ugh.
Yeah, right.
I
Being able to
know.
walk, like, see where you're going, and not have to worry about like every noise that you hear being something that can maul you.
Oh yeah, that's part of the fun.
Yeah, exactly.
No. Well, look, guys, this is great. It's always good having you guys on. It's always even better when we have a fun new piece of gear to talk about. I will remind all you guys that we do have some wonderful Sigma events coming up this summer with the B&H event space, both in person and online. So definitely check out our website for that. If you guys haven't heard me harp about our new YouTube channel, just go to YouTube, look up B&H event space. If you're watching it live on YouTube right now, well, guess what? You've already found us. Everything will be archived online for you guys to watch at your own leisure. But a huge thank you to Jack Fusco, Aaron Norberg joining us for Sigma, and the entire Sigma team for hosting today's event and making this possible. And to all of our viewers out there, of course, you always know we do it for you. Can't do it without you. So thank you for watching. Thank you for your feedback. And I will now say that we are good for today. It's a wrap. In the
Thank
books.
you so much. Yeah.
Thank you guys again. And yeah, another rendition of the B&H virtual event space now coming to a close. We'll check y'all next time.
Well, thanks everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks for
guys.
joining us.